Welcome to the Mystery and Horror channel. Get ready for dark stories that will give you chills. Before we start, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay tuned for every new mystery. Now turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let's dive into terror. Story 1. The Trunk in the Guest Room. When I moved into the house that had once belonged to my great-grandmother, I knew I would find old objects and forgotten memories. The place had an air of nostalgia with dark wooden furniture and faded paintings on the walls. However, one item always caught my attention: an iron trunk that sat in the corner of the guest room. It had intricate carvings forming patterns of vines and flowers, and its lock was secured with a rusty, heavy padlock. No one in the family knew what was inside, and the trunk had become a sort of legend. One cold night, driven by curiosity, I decided to try to open the trunk. I took a screwdriver and, with some effort, managed to force the padlock until it broke with a sharp snap. The sound echoed through the empty room, and for a moment I felt a chill. I slowly lifted the lid, and the smell of mold and dust invaded my nostrils. Inside there was an old yellowed diary stained with age and a set of porcelain dolls, all with expressions that seemed sinister under the dim light of the lamp. I picked up the diary and sat on the bed to leaf through it. The pages were written in fine, elegant handwriting, full of details about my great-grandmother's life and her worries about the house and the children. But the last pages were different. She spoke of voices she heard at night and shadows moving around the guest room. "They come from the trunk," said one of the last entries, and the letters trembled as if written in haste. I put the diary back in the trunk and closed the lid with a thud. I tried to forget what I had read, but that night, I woke up to the sound of soft, childish laughter echoing down the hallway. I got up slowly, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end, and heard a faint scratching like nails tapping on wood. The sound was coming from the guest room. Holding a flashlight, I approached the door to the room. The air was cold and the smell of mold was stronger. I opened the door and shone the light inside. The trunk was open and the porcelain dolls were standing, facing me. One of them, with a wide grin and bulging eyes, seemed to have moved from its original position. The scratching continued, now coming from inside the trunk. Before I could react, the lid slammed shut with a bang. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the room again, and I felt my heart race. I stepped back and shut the door, locking it with the key. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening to the muffled sounds coming from the guest room, whispers and laughter that kept me on edge. The next morning, I called an antique dealer to assess the trunk and told him what had happened. He looked at me with a serious expression and said that objects like this were often used in old rituals to trap souls or energies. "These dolls may have been more than just toys," he said, and advised me to close the trunk and never open it again. Since then, the guest room has remained locked, and the trunk is covered with a sheet. But sometimes, when the house is quiet, I can still hear faint scratching and laughter that seems to come from another time, reminding me that the past never completely disappears. Story 2. The Rocking Chair. In the house where I grew up, there was a rocking chair that always made me feel inexplicably uneasy. It sat on the back porch, facing the forest that stretched beyond the fence. It was an old chair, made of dark wood, with carvings of flowers and leaves that seemed to come alive in the evening shadows. My grandmother said it belonged to her mother, who would spend hours sitting there, gazing at the trees and whispering things no one could hear. After my grandmother passed away, the chair remained on the porch, rocking on its own on windy nights, producing a low, rhythmic creaking. I always assumed it was the wind until the night I woke up to a different sound. It was the sound of rocking, but there was no wind accompanying it. I got up and went to the window, looking out at the porch lit only by the pale glow of the moon. The chair was moving, rocking back and forth as if an invisible presence were seated in it. For a few seconds, fear froze me. A faint whisper reached me, soft and indistinguishable, like a murmur. The chair suddenly stopped rocking, and the sensation of being watched was so strong that I closed the curtain and backed away. I tried convincing myself it was my imagination, but the creaking continued, echoing through the house like an unwelcome presence. The next morning, I told my mother what had happened, but she just smiled, saying the house was old and full of memories. Determined to learn more about the chair, I went up to the attic to search for old photos or anything that could explain my great-grandmother's connection to it. I found a dusty photo album and, among the faded pictures, saw a photograph of her, young, sitting in the rocking chair, looking at the camera with an enigmatic smile. Behind her, in the forest, a blurred and indistinct figure seemed to be hiding among the trees. That night, the creaking returned, but this time it sounded closer, as if it was inside the house. I got up, my heart pounding in my chest, and went downstairs. The rocking chair was now in the middle of the living room, moving slowly, its creaking forming words. The air around it was colder, and the smell of damp earth filled my nose. I heard the whispers again, clearer this time. "Can you hear me now?" Before I could react, the chair stopped, and the silence was suffocating. A chill ran down my spine as a breeze passed over me, raising the hairs on my neck. I ran back to my room, locking the door and staying awake until dawn. The next day, my mother noticed the chair out of place and asked if I had moved it. I denied it, but the fear in my eyes made her understand that something more had happened. She told me that before my great-grandmother passed away, she claimed the chair was a portal to hear the voices of the forest, and that she would sit in it to talk with those who had already left. The story left me even more uneasy, and that afternoon, we decided to move the chair to the shed in the backyard, locking it away to never see it again. Even with the chair gone from the porch, the nights remained strange. Sometimes I still hear the sound of rocking coming from the shed, even when everything is still. And on the quietest nights, I can still hear whispers carried by the wind, as if my great-grandmother were still sitting there, trying to say something we never fully understood. Story 3, The Voice on the Road. Once, I traveled with a group of friends to an isolated cabin in the countryside. The road to get there was narrow, surrounded by tall, twisted trees that formed a natural tunnel. We were excited, talking and laughing, but as the sun began to set and the golden light gave way to shadows, the mood changed. The silence of the forest seemed to watch us, and the road seemed to stretch longer than expected. When we finally arrived at the cabin, the sky was already dark, and the only light came from the car's headlights and a dim lamp on the porch. While unloading our bags, I heard a distant sound like a voice calling my name. I paused for a moment, a shiver running down my spine. I looked at my friends, but none of them seemed to have noticed. I took a deep breath and ignored it, thinking the fatigue from the trip was playing tricks on me. That night, after a few hours of talking and laughter, we went to bed. The cabin was enveloped in silence, except for the sound of the wind whispering through the trees. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a peculiar sound. It was a low voice, almost imperceptible, coming from the road. I got up and went to the window, but all I could see was darkness and the moon's reflection on the dirt road. I went back to bed, trying to ignore the feeling of unease, but the voice returned, clearer this time. "Come." It was a call, soft and insistent. This time my friends woke up too. One of them, Lucas, turned on the light and looked at me with wide eyes. "Did you hear that too?" he asked, and we all nodded, fear written across our faces. We decided to check what was going on. With flashlights in hand, we stepped out onto the porch, where the air was colder than before. The sound of the wind was louder, and the voice returned, now a lament echoing from the road. "Please come." Lucas's flashlight shook, and he muttered that we should go back inside. But before we could move, we saw a pale figure standing in the middle of the road, turned away from us. The figure was tall and wore clothes that looked like they belonged to another era. Long hair fell over the shoulders, and it didn't move. We stood frozen, the silence between us and the figure almost palpable. Lucas took a step forward, and the figure slowly turned. Even in the dim light, its face was indistinct, shrouded in shadow, but the eyes glowed a silver hue, fixed on us with a cold intensity. The voice whispered again, but this time it was clear in our minds, "You shouldn't be here." Fear overtook us, and we ran back inside, locking all the doors and windows. The sound of the wind seemed to turn into a scream, and the figure disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the sensation that something was watching us. We spent the rest of the night in silence, awake and alert to any sound. When dawn came, the road looked harmless and the figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched never left. We left the cabin that very day without looking back. Back in town, we tried to forget what had happened, but the stories about that road still circulate among the locals. They say that sometimes at night, a figure appears calling out to travelers, luring them into the darkness. And whenever I hear about that region, I remember the voice that called to us and the silver eyes that seemed to pierce my soul. Story 4. The Book of Shadows. When I started working at the local library, an old building that defied time with its stone facade and Gothic windows, I heard many stories about a book that no one dared to take off the shelf. It was known as the Book of Shadows and was kept in the rare book section, on a shelf that seemed untouched. Its cover was made of black leather, worn and marked with strange silver symbols. I thought it was just a tale to scare new employees, but over time my curiosity grew. One rainy night, I was the last to leave the library, tasked with closing the building. The wind howled outside and the rain pattered against the windows, creating an unsettling melody. I decided to take advantage of the quiet moment to see the famous book. I walked to the rare books section and there it was, dusty and cloaked in ancient mystery. I touched the cold cover and felt a slight tingling in my fingers. I opened it and the yellowed pages were filled with symbols and writings I couldn't understand. As I flipped through the pages, a low whisper echoed in the room, as if distant voices were having a discussion. I lifted my head, but no one was there. The whisper stopped, and the silence returned, heavier than before. Suddenly, the light in the room began to flicker, and a chill ran down my spine. The wind seemed to grow stronger, and the library door slammed shut on its own, even though it was locked. I quickly closed the book and put it back on the shelf, but the whisper returned, now clearer and more insistent. "You shouldn't have touched it." My breathing became ragged and I stepped back, glancing around the empty aisles. A long shadow stretched across the floor, but there was no one there to cast it. The lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, I saw a tall, hooded figure reflected in the window. Its eyes shone darkly like deep pools of shadow. I ran for the door, the whispers growing louder behind me, forming words that sounded like an incantation or a curse. When I finally made it out and locked the library, I felt the weight of something watching me from the window. The next day, I tried to tell my colleague, an older librarian who had been there for years, what had happened. He looked at me with a serious expression and simply said, "You opened a path you shouldn't have. Never touch that book again." The following nights were filled with unsettling dreams, where shadows danced around me and voices called my name, urging me to return. The library seemed colder each day, and the whispers I once heard only when I was alone now echoed in every corner, even when others were present. One night, I found the book open on a study table, even though I was sure I had locked it away. The pages were turned to a symbol that seemed to pulse, almost breathe. The whisper spoke again, soft and dark. "Come." Desperate, I took the book to the library director, who, wide-eyed, told me it should never have been taken off the shelf. "That book was sealed for a reason," he said, returning it to the shelf, this time chaining it up. But even with the book secured, the feeling that something had been awakened remained. Since then, the library has never felt the same. The lights flicker more often, and sometimes I see shadows moving between the shelves, always watching, waiting. And at night, when the wind blows strongest, I can hear the whispers coming from the building, calling for someone who dared to touch what should have been left undisturbed. Story 5. The Song of the Old Gramophone. In my grandparents' house, there was an attic that we always avoided. It was dark and dusty, filled with trunks, old furniture, and forgotten memories. Amid all those relics was a gramophone, a device that had been there for as long as I could remember. My grandmother said it belonged to her father, a man who loved music but had a peculiar taste for melancholic songs. It was said he would spend hours listening to one specific piece, even on the day he suddenly passed away, still sitting in his favorite chair with the gramophone playing. One day, while helping my grandmother organize the attic, I was drawn to the gramophone. It looked cleaner than the rest of the things around it, as if it had recently been touched. Curious, I wound the crank and placed the needle on the record that was already there, covered by a thin layer of dust. The song that began to play was mournful, carrying an indescribable weight. For a moment, A chill ran through my skin, but I continued listening. My grandmother, hearing the music, rushed up the stairs with wide eyes and an expression of fear. "Turn that off now," she shouted, her voice trembling. I ran to stop the gramophone, but the needle wouldn't move, as if stuck. The song continued, louder and more intense. Finally, I managed to force it off, and the silence that followed was deafening. My grandmother sat down in an old chair, pale and shaking. "You shouldn't have played that," she murmured. She told me that the last time the gramophone had been played, strange things began to happen in the house. Whispering voices, shadows dancing on the walls, and the music playing on its own in the middle of the night. My great-grandfather had claimed that the song was a way to communicate with someone from the other side, but no one ever knew who he spoke to. That night, after putting away all the items from the attic, I went to bed with an uneasy feeling. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a faint and familiar sound. The gramophone's melody echoed through the house, playing on its own, even though it was locked in the attic. I got up and walked down the dark hallway, the music growing louder with each step. The attic door was ajar, and a dim light seemed to pulse inside. I climbed the creaking stairs slowly. At the top, I saw the gramophone turning, the needle moving on the record, and a shadow cast on the wall. It was tall and thin, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, swaying to the music. My heart stopped for a second as the shadow turned slowly, as if it had sensed my presence. "Why are you here?" a low, deep voice whispered, as if coming from the gramophone itself. The notes distorted, becoming sharper and faster, and the shadow advanced, moving in an oddly fluid manner. I stumbled back onto the first step and fell, seated. The music stopped abruptly, and silence enveloped the attic. The next morning, I told my grandmother what had happened, and she decided it was time to get rid of the gramophone. She called an antiquarian, who looked at it with a grave expression. "This should not be here," he said. "There are stories about gramophones used in old rituals, to summon spirits or communicate with the beyond. Since then, the attic was cleared and the gramophone taken away. But sometimes, even without it, the melody still echoes faintly through the house, as if a past echo refuses to leave. And on the quietest nights, I can swear I still see the shadow dancing along the wall, waiting for someone brave enough to listen again." Story 6. The Forgotten Locket. My great-aunt, a reclusive woman full of mysteries, passed away one October afternoon, leaving me her small house on a secluded hill. The place was surrounded by tall trees and had an old-world atmosphere, with antique furniture and walls lined with framed portraits that seemed to follow anyone who passed by. While sorting through her belongings, I found a small silver locket in a drawer in her bedroom. It was delicate, etched with a pattern of roses, and had a tiny latch that looked like it had never been opened. Curiosity got the better of me, and after some effort, I managed to pry it open. Inside was a faded photo of a young girl with large, sad eyes. On the other side, a lock of dark hair was carefully tucked in. The air in the room seemed to change the moment I opened the locket, turning colder and heavier. The sound of birds outside ceased, and for a moment, I heard a whisper that seemed to come from within the house. "Why did you find me?" I shut the locket quickly and put it back in the drawer, trying to shake off the unease. That night, the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. The shadows cast by the moonlight seemed to shift, moving slowly along the walls. A soft sound of light footsteps echoed in the hallway, and I heard a faint scratching at the bedroom door. I locked it and sat on the bed, my eyes fixed on the doorknob, which appeared to tremble slightly. Around 3 in the morning, the silence was broken by a child's laugh, soft, drawn out, and chilling. I glanced at the drawer where I had placed the locket, only to see it open. The locket was now on top of the table, its lid ajar. The whisper returned, but this time it was close at the foot of the bed. "You saw?" I stood up slowly, my breathing ragged, and picked up the locket with trembling hands. The moment I touched it, a cold shiver ran through me, and the girl's eyes in the photo seemed to blink, as if looking straight at me with a sudden spark of life. I shut the locket and rushed out of the room, heading to the living room where the lit lamps gave me a fleeting sense of safety. But that feeling didn't last. The windows started to shake as if a strong wind was blowing outside, although the night was still. The lights flickered, and in the window pane, I saw the reflection of a girl with dark hair and a fixed stare. She wasn't in the room, but her image seemed to observe me, as though the glass was a thin barrier between us. The laugh echoed again and the voice whispered, "Let me out." The next morning, I went to a neighbor who had known my great-aunt for years. I told her what had happened, and she looked at me with eyes full of understanding and hidden fear. "She kept that locket as a promise," the neighbor said. "They said it belonged to her younger sister who disappeared when they were children. They never found the girl, but your great-aunt always said she was still in the house, waiting." Desperate, I took the locket to a local church and asked the priest for help. He examined it, muttered a prayer, and advised me to bury it in consecrated ground. I followed his advice, and for a while the house seemed more peaceful. But on the darkest nights, when the wind blows strongly and shadows stretch long, I can still hear a child's laugh and the whisper that echoes through the house. "I'm still here." Story 7. The Painter in the Window. When I rented my new apartment downtown, I was enchanted by the view it offered. From the fourth floor, I could see the rooftops of old houses and a plaza that, at night, lit up with soft lights and strolling people. However, one odd detail stood out: an abandoned house across the street with tall, dirty windows that seemed to silently observe the city. It was said that the house had belonged to an eccentric painter who mysteriously disappeared over 50 years ago. On my first night there, as I unpacked some boxes, I looked out the window and noticed a faint light coming from the abandoned house. It flickered as if moving between rooms like someone holding a candle. I blinked a few times, thinking I was tired, but the light continued to dance. I chose to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. The next night, as I tried to sleep, I heard a low sound of footsteps on the street. I got up and looked out the window to see the silhouette of a tall, thin man standing on the upper floor of the abandoned house. He was facing me, but with his head tilted, giving the impression he was focused on something in particular. A chill ran down my spine as he raised an arm slowly, as if painting in the air. After a moment, the light went out and he disappeared into the darkness. I mentioned what I saw to a neighbor in the hallway, and he gave me a tense smile. "You saw the painter, didn't you? They say he's still looking for the masterpiece he never finished," he said, avoiding my gaze. He told me that some people would see shadows in the windows at night and hear the sound of brushes scraping wood, as if someone was tirelessly painting. Intrigued, I dug deeper into the story. I learned that the painter was obsessed with capturing the essence of the soul in his work, and his last piece was a self-portrait that he never completed. It was said that on the darkest nights, he continued his quest, seeking models to capture their expressions. That night, the unease grew. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a faint scratching sound, like the stroke of a brush on canvas, coming from somewhere nearby. I looked out the window and saw the shadow clearly this time. The man was in the window, and the moonlight lit his eyes, which were dark, deep spots. He raised an arm and, with a slow gesture, pointed directly at me. The scratching sound grew louder, echoing inside my room as if it came from within. The sense of being watched intensified, and the walls seemed to have eyes that followed me. I picked up a flashlight and shone it at the abandoned house, but the shadow was gone. Suddenly, a reflection in my window made me freeze. At the far end of my room stood a tall, thin silhouette holding a brush. Before I could turn around, I felt a slight pressure on my neck, as if someone was drawing on my skin with an invisible brush. The scratching sound stopped abruptly, and the silhouette vanished. I rushed to turn on all the lights, my heart pounding. The sensation of having been touched lingered, and a faint smell of paint filled the air. The next morning, I found a mark on my neck, a thin, dark line like the first strokes of a drawing. I decided to move out soon after. But even with distance, I still dream of the painter. In the stillness of the night, I can hear the brushes sound and feel the unseen eyes that, from somewhere, are still trying to capture my soul in his unfinished masterpiece. Story 8. The Stairs to the Basement. My family moved into an old countryside house, an isolated place surrounded by trees and open fields. It was a structure over a century old, with thick walls and large windows that creaked when the wind blew hard. On the first day as we explored, I noticed a small, nearly hidden door in the kitchen floor that led to a basement. My mother mentioned that it had been locked for years and that the previous owner had lost the key. Strangely, the feeling that something watched us from behind that door made me avoid that corner of the kitchen. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, I woke up to a low, rhythmic sound, like something tapping lightly on the basement door. I looked at the clock. It was 3 in the morning. Barefoot, I walked to the kitchen, where the moonlight cast pale reflections on the tiled walls. The sound stopped as I approached, but the air felt cold and a musty smell enveloped me. Suddenly, I heard a faint creak and the basement door moved slightly as if something pushed from below. My heart raced and I stepped back, nearly tripping over a chair. Silence returned, but I knew I was not alone. The next morning, I told my mother what had happened, but she just shook her head, thinking I'd dreamed it. Yet the unease stayed with me. In the following days, I continued to hear the tapping at the same hour. I shared this with my older brother, Lucas, who, despite his skepticism, agreed to check it out with me. We waited until the house was silent. Around 3 in the morning, the tapping began again. Lucas turned on a flashlight and we approached the basement door. The sound stopped, but this time, a faint whisper, almost inaudible, came from the other side of the wood. "Let me out." Lucas backed away, eyes wide, and a shiver ran down my spine. With a serious expression, he suggested we search for the basement key. Over the next few days, we scoured the house until we found it in an old toolbox forgotten in a cabinet. It was a large, heavy key that seemed burdened with untold secrets. That night, with hearts pounding like drums, we descended the stairs to unlock the basement door. The key turned with difficulty, and the click of the lock echoed in the empty kitchen. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase that led into darkness. The air that rose was colder and smelled of mold, but there was something else, a metallic, sweet scent that made my stomach churn. We carefully stepped down, the flashlight beam dancing across the damp stone walls. At the bottom, we saw an old rocking chair facing away from us. Lucas swallowed hard and moved closer, but before he could touch it, a soft, slow laugh echoed in the room. The chair began to rock on its own, and a whisper came from the darkest corner. "You came." The flashlight flickered, and a tall, misshapen shadow shifted on the wall, rising as if it emerged from the darkness itself. Lucas grabbed my arm, and we raced up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind us. The sound of footsteps and scratching on the other side made the door vibrate but soon stopped, leaving only an oppressive silence. Since then, the basement door remains locked and the key hidden. My mother never knew what we found, but the house was never the same. On the coldest nights, the tapping returns and the creak of the rocking chair can be heard faintly. And in the wind that blows through the kitchen, I swear I can still hear a whisper, "Come back." Story 9, The Mirror Room. When I moved into the old apartment in the city center, the landlord warned me not to worry about the back room. She said it was just a storage space and that the door was kept locked because the latch was broken. I found this odd, but I didn't think much of it until my first night there. The moonlight filtered through the thin living room curtains, casting shadows that danced across the walls, and the silence was deep, broken only by the soft ticking of an antique clock. Around midnight, I woke to a scratching sound like fingernails lightly scraping wood. It came from the back room. I got up slowly and approached the door, listening closely. The noise stopped, but a creeping sensation of being watched raised the hair on my neck. I went back to bed, determined to ignore it. The next night, the scratching returned, now accompanied by a faint murmur. This time I couldn't resist and tapped lightly on the door. The murmuring ceased, and for a moment I thought I heard a muffled laugh. The idea that someone or something could be inside made me uneasy, so I decided to find the key the next day. I found the key in an old drawer in the kitchen, yellowed with age and a bit rusted. With my heart pounding, I waited for nightfall, and with the key in hand, I approached the back room. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open, revealing a dusty space filled with old furniture and stacked boxes. What caught my attention was a large mirror propped against the opposite wall, framed in ornate iron, draped with a white sheet. Hesitantly, I pulled the sheet away. The mirror reflected the room, but the image seemed slightly warped, as if the glass rippled. I looked at my reflection and, for a second, thought my eyes looked darker than usual. I blinked and my reflection returned to normal. I sighed, laughing at my nerves. That night, the noise came back, louder, as if coming from the mirror itself. I walked to the back room and saw something that made me freeze. In the reflection, a figure stood behind me, pale and blank, with no features except for two dark, gleaming eyes. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I looked at the mirror again, the figure was gone, but a faint smudge on the glass spelled out one word: stay. The flashlight in my hand began to flicker, and footsteps echoed in the room. The figure reappeared in the mirror, closer now, and a deep, raspy whisper filled the air. Come. Terror gripped me and I ran out of the room, slamming the door shut. I locked it and put the key back in the drawer, vowing never to open it again. In the days that followed, I avoided the back room, but the feeling of being watched never went away. Sometimes as I walked past the hallway, I caught a fleeting glimpse of the mirror through the crack in the door, and the figure was there, watching, waiting for me to return. The nights became more restless, with the sound of scratching and murmurs blending into the silence. I told a friend what had happened, and he suggested removing the mirror. Reluctantly, I called two men to take it away. As they carried it out, one of them paused and looked at me with an odd expression. "Are you sure you want to get rid of this?" he asked, his voice hesitant. I just nodded and they took it away. Since then, the scratching has stopped, but the sense that something left with the mirror lingers. And sometimes, when I glance at my reflection in other mirrors, I see, for just an instant, a pair of dark eyes watching me, as if waiting for the right moment to return. Story 10. The Antique Fair Box. It was a sunny day when I passed through an antique fair in the city center. Among piles of old books, dusty relics, and curious objects, one item caught my attention. A small wooden box intricately carved with what seemed to tell a story of its own. The vendor, an old man with weary eyes and tattered clothes, watched me as I examined the box. "That piece has history," he said in a hoarse, low voice. "It was found in an abandoned house, and they say it carries echoes of its previous owners." I smiled, thinking it was just a sales tactic, and bought the box out of curiosity. At home, I placed it on the living room table and studied the carvings more closely. Small, detailed figures, faces, trees, and what looked like a moon with eyes. That night, I woke to a soft sound like gentle drumming coming from the living room. I got up and went to check, only to find the box slightly open. The air was colder than usual, and the full moon cast a silvery light across the room. I touched the box's lid and closed it, but a shiver ran down my spine as I heard a low, slow whisper. "Why did you bring me back?" I blinked a few times, convinced I was imagining things, and went back to bed. However, during the night, the sound returned. This time, it was clearer, a soft, mournful melody, played on what sounded like stringed instruments. I opened the door to the living room and found the box open again. The moon's reflection made the carved figures seem to move, as if they were alive for a fleeting moment. In the following days, the melody repeated itself every night at the same time, exactly at midnight. The sense of being watched grew stronger, and shadows flickered at the corners of my vision. I decided to find the vendor to ask about the box, but when I returned to the fair, he was gone. Another vendor who knew him told me that he had disappeared weeks before I bought the box, leaving all his items behind. That night, the music returned, louder and accompanied by faint, distant laughter, as if a party were happening somewhere nearby. When I walked into the living room, I saw that the box was now fully open, emitting a soft, golden glow. Inside, something moved, a tiny figure with a grinning face and empty eyes, dancing to the tune. I stepped back and the melody stopped abruptly. The figure inside the box slowly turned its head toward me, and a whisper filled the room. "Now you dance with me." The lights flickered, and a cold wind swept through the room, sending papers and curtains flying. The box snapped shut with a loud click, and the silence that followed was deafening. The next day, I took the box to an antique expert who widened his eyes when he saw it and murmured something in a language I didn't understand. He told me never to open it again and explained that such boxes were once used in ancient rituals to summon spirits that loved music and dancing, never stopping until they claimed a new soul to join them. Since then, the box has remained locked away in a safe. But even so, on full moon nights, I can still hear the distant melody and faint laughter, as if an unseen party is continuing, waiting for me to join. And sometimes when I pass the living room, I feel a slight tug on my clothes, as if something is trying to pull me into the dance that never ends. If you made it this far, the mystery has hooked you. So, leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to follow each new story. Thanks for watching and see you in the next terror.